Hello and welcome to Contact. I'm Craig Delahunt, and on today's show we'll be talking with Gordon Wilson, leader of the BC Liberal Party. Thanks for joining us, Gordon.
My pleasure, Craig.
Gordon, I'm sure you've got lots to say on the political climate here in Canada and BC, but first let's talk a little bit about your background. You were born in Vancouver, yet you grew up in Kenya. How did that come about?
Well, I was taken at an early age from Vancouver. My father was an anthropologist and was studying for his PhD at London School of Economics, and most of his field work, in fact, was in Tanzania, then Tanganyika. So I really didn't have much choice in the matter. I was taken along as hand luggage, so to speak.
Was he working in conjunction with Leakey?
Well, he wasn't working actually specifically with Leakey, although we did live next door to the Leakeys for a fair length of time. My father was a social anthropologist as opposed to an archaeologist, so he was looking more at the Barabike people, and he later among the Luo people in central Kenya, rather than looking at the prehistoric archaeological kinds of things that Leakey was involved with.
Mm-hmm. What was the area like where you lived? Were you living in an urban area, or were you out in the outskirts?
Oh, no, definitely not. In fact, the next closest family to us was 50 miles. It was very much, when we first went out, we went to a small place called Katesh, which is just south of the Serengeti, which is known, I think, to most people around the world because of the vast plains animals that are there, and now, of course, a very famous game reserve. No, it was very much rural. My backyard extended for thousands of miles before you found a fence, and for, as I say, 50 miles before you found the next settlement, which was a settlement of the Barabike people.
What sort of creatures did you grow up with? Animals, exotic?
Well, I don't know that we called them exotic. I had a baboon when I was very young, and that was sort of a playmate, and people make some humor out of that, you know, as to did you really learn the tactics that you know today in BC politics from the baboon? Sometimes looking at the legislature you might think so, but no, we had many different animals that were around. We had a leopard for a while, we had a cheetah, usually orphaned animals that were found on the plains that we would bring in and befriend when they were small. Of course, these animals were wild, and as they got older, obviously they posed somewhat of a threat, and what we did is try to move them off into the game reserve so that they had a habitat that they could be safe in and free from hunting.
Did you ever have any close encounters with animals? Is there anything that could have been called dangerous?
I would think the closest encounter that I can recall, we had our dog was essentially taken by a leopard that came in right through the window and under the table and picked the dog up and was gone out the back door, which can be a little disconcerting when you're sitting down to dinner, you know, and your dog gets dragged out the back door by a leopard. A little unusual also that a cat of prey would come that close to light and to humans and so on, but no, there were obvious problems. It's interesting though, Craig, as I look back on it, I can't remember it being anything other than normal growing up, although now I think if I was to expose my son to the everyday kinds of dangers that I grew up with, I would think that as a parent I should be somewhat disciplined for doing that.
Did you ever climb Kilimanjaro?
Yes, twice, right to the very peak, and that really of my strongest memories, I think that the last climb up Mount Kilimanjaro was without a doubt the strongest. It's very hard to explain to BC audiences or to audiences anywhere until you've really sat at the top of the peak of this mountain, roughly 20,000 feet in elevation, and you can look down over the vast Serengeti plain out toward the Indian Ocean, and to see these huge dust storms that are created by massive herds of elephant, and you know that had a profound effect on me as a young individual. Mostly because realizing that sitting there and witnessing that was a phenomenon in the evolution of the Earth that my children probably would never see.
At that time you thought that it may be a passing?
Oh, there was no question. There was no doubt. The movement toward independence, toward the Western-style democracy, toward the dominance of the human species over every other species, that was something that was apparent to me at a very early age, and I think it's a great tragedy that humankind has not understood the extent to which its relentless pursuit of material gain has cost us unmeasurable amounts of damage and loss in terms of what the world provided us in its original form.
What species that say were common and do you know now are almost extinct or very, very endangered?
Well, there are very many of them. Many species that many people perhaps here wouldn't know, but the potto, for one, which is a nocturnal animal, fur-bearing animal, heavily preyed on for its fur, is virtually gone. The elephant itself is now a bit on the comeback. The rhino, as a large animal, is really very close to biological extinction, and most of the rhino that exists today exist in game farms. These kinds of things are tragic in the real sense, and they tend to be the animals that we know about. What causes me great concern is that there are such a large number of species, not only animal but insect species, that we have taken to extinction without even knowing that they ever existed. And I think that's it's not only a great loss to us in terms of the natural history of the planet, but it's a great loss to us because those species are critically important if one considers that we are all interlinked and that none of us exist of ourselves, unto ourselves, and by ourselves. And so every time we push a species to extinction, we are irrevocably changing the natural history and course of direction of this planet. And I think that as a politician, that certainly is something that I'm taking much more to heart now, as hopefully I have an opportunity to do something about that.
What about the park itself? Is it endangered? Is there more pressure on it for farming?
Well, obviously the population of Kenya is the fastest growing population of any nation state in the world, with a possible exception of Mexico. It has a very fast growing population. They have a very strong demand on agricultural production and agricultural land because as a nation, Kenya has no primary extractive industry, in the sense that it has no minerals, it has no timber, and so agriculture is the #1 industry outside of tourism. Obviously, the need for agricultural land that can put into production export crops, coffee, sugar, those kinds of things, tea, which we enjoy in the developed world, is very definitely bringing a real crunch onto lands that have traditionally been used for wildlife.
How about school? Was there separation between the blacks and whites, or?
Well, for the most part, yes, there was. Certainly up until independence in 1963, and even post-independence, the schools were segregated. There were white schools, there were Asian schools, and then there were black schools. That's changed a great deal, obviously, now. The integration of education is very much a part of life there. But in the colonial days, it wasn't done. And so, yes, there was segregation, and it, interestingly enough, because we live so far away from the urban centers, that most of my contact, in fact, was not that way. That in order to get education, I went to whatever schools were available, and in the rural parts of Africa where schools existed at all, they really were not segregated there.
Speaking of the colonial days, I guess you were there while the Mau Mau revolution took place. Can you tell us about that?
Well, the Mau Mau was an interesting time, and I mean, as a young individual, I didn't really fully understand what was going on, other than the fact that the state really was clamping down on individual freedoms and individual rights of people. But historically now, as I look back on it, it really was a fight. It was a tribal conflict more than anything else.
Was it the Maasai, or?
No, it was the Kikuyu. The Kikuyu people, who were the largest of the tribes, were essentially trying to initiate their members into the Mau Mau, which was to be this revolutionary force that was going to bring independence to Kenya, and in doing so also maintain and retain the superiority of the Kikuyu people. Mm-hmm. I think in terms of its effect on me, I can remember that I lived in a police state, and British Columbians I think are perhaps a little complacent about the fact that
you see an association.
Well, not so much an association, but a real danger when you are complacent and allow the kinds of government that we're starting to see in British Columbia now, where you have a suspension of parliamentary democracy for so many issues. I mean, we're spending by warrant, putting too much power in the hands of one premier, those kinds of things. Really do start to take away from the individual rights and freedoms of the individual, and that I guess really is why I'm a liberal. I firmly believe that above all we must protect fundamental rights and freedoms, or we have nothing in our democracy. And so during the Mau Mau, to come back to that question, clearly that was a time when there was a suspension of individual liberties.
Well, it was a very savage war, wasn't it?
Among the black people, very much so. Not really among the white people, although I understand the Western press, of course, every time there was a white person killed, it would be headlines. The fact that there would be a few thousand black people killed would not even receive coverage, or if it did, it'd be in the D section in the last page of the paper. Really, I mean, I think in the total Mau Mau period, I don't think there were more than 20 to 30 whites actually killed. It was not an aggression against white people. It was an aggression, a black tribal person against other black tribal people, and as such, it was a very bloody and very violent, very brutal kind of social revolution.
Where do you see Africa going? It's just a hard question. And then, is it a retail outlet for arms?
Where do I see Africa going? I think that will largely depend on two things: what happens in South Africa and the extent to which apartheid can be overcome, and some kind of regime maintained that will hold that economy together. Because the South African economy is an extremely important one in continental Africa. The second thing is what happens with the Middle East and the Gulf crisis now. And I say that because much of Saharan Africa, the northern part of Africa, is in fact tied into this Muslim conflict, the Muslim-Christian conflict, the Muslim-Jew conflict. So Africa, in a sense, has got, on the one hand, the South African question at its bottom end, and it has the Gulf crisis at its top end. As a continent, Africa is going to have to work much more closely in terms of building the nation-state alliance within the Pan-African alliance. Is it an outlet for arms? It's certainly a good place for Western nations to sell weaponry. I find the hypocrisy, and that's what it is, I think the hypocrisy among Western nations that we see now displayed in this outrage that this Saddam Hussein is such a brutal dictator has transpired in Africa for years. I mean, Idi Amin was a brutal dictator. There have been many brutal dictators, and ask yourself the question, in every case, where did these people get their arms? In every case, they got them from Western countries whose governments, either complicitly or directly, permitted sale. And so I don't know that it's an outlet for arms. It's certainly a good market for arms, and I think that you are going to see despot governments set up where they're going to maintain law and order through strong military alliances. And that has to end. I mean, we have to collectively recognize that when the Gulf crisis is over, let's hope that we've not only disarmed Iraq, but let's disarm George Bush, and let's disarm Mikhail Gorbachev and everybody else to the extent that we can have a greater degree of global peace.
So you're looking for some accountability amongst the arms suppliers, amongst the politicians?
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt. I mean, you talk about abridgment of international law through the invasion of Kuwait, which it clearly was, and clearly this man, Saddam Hussein, is a man who is not to be trusted, and certainly not a man that we're going to give any credibility to as a leader in terms of the butchering that he did in Kuwait. But the violation of international law goes on every day in terms of companies that are selling weaponry to governments that have gained power through brutal military coup. These are not democracies. I mean, Kuwait was not a democracy, and Kuwait will not return to being a democracy. And so there is a real level of hypocrisy in society when we on the one hand say that our rights and freedoms and our democratic system is the way it should be. At the same time, we're prepared to supply arms and ammunition and weapons to anybody who's prepared to do our bidding. And the minute that they do something that we don't like, we're going to come and drop unprecedented amounts of bombs, and not on them, but on the people that are already subjected to the kind of dictatorship. It's no way to build world peace, and it's certainly no way to build the so-called New World Order. And what I hear coming out of the mouth of George Bush scares me to death.
Maybe we will see a new world awareness. From Africa, now you're teaching at Capilano College. What are the courses you're teaching, and can you give us a brief rundown on maybe your philosophy as far as the environment?
I teach three courses primarily at Capilano. I teach a course in Canadian geography, which is a regional Canadian course. I teach a course in resource management, which is really economic geography, and I teach a course in environmental geography, which is perhaps the resource management and environmental geography really are the areas that I'm most comfortable with. My philosophy, I have taken great issue with this concept of sustainable development, as I think you know, Craig. My feeling is that we have to start to get back to the fundamentals of the finite limits within our environment. We have to start to recognize limits to growth. And I think the Club of Rome report, which was heralded in the 70s, really is as relevant today, if not more relevant today, than it was then. We have to recognize that we have a global population that 6 billion is going to, in the next 35 years, or 25 to 35 years, be somewhere between 10 and 11 billions of us. All of those people are going to have increased expectations, increased demand on our resources, increased demand on our consumption, without recognizing that the capacity to supply those demands
has already been reached.
Exactly, reached, and in fact, in some instances, I think we're over the limits. Look at BC forestry. We've pushed ourselves in terms of the allowable cut to the extent that we're going to be in serious trouble in 5 to 10 years, very serious trouble.
What do you think of the fishery industry here in BC? How does it compare to what happened on the East Coast?
Well, we seem to be repeating exactly the same mistakes. I mean, it seems to me that it's ironic that we have one of the finest natural fisheries in the world off our doorstep, and we've done very little to try and enhance it by natural means. The idea that they went into the hatchery program and that they started the buyback program to buy boats out of the fishery was perhaps a conservation measure that was good to put a stop to overfishing and to the abundant overcatch. But that by itself was not enough. We've got a drift net fishery out there that currently the Japanese are very active in, that is an absolute travesty and needs to be stopped. We've got active forest industry here that really doesn't seem to be paying a lot of attention to stream enhancement and maintaining and protecting streams in our coastal areas. So that on the one hand, we're doing something to try and maintain the fishery, but on the other hand, we've got a situation where other resource competitors are really causing us a serious amount of damage. And the solution? Privatize the industry and go into trying raising them in net pens. I mean, to me, this is aquaculture I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. It typifies the approach that Canadians have had to problem solving. Instead of saying the problem is that we need to enhance our industry by enhancing the natural environment that supports the fishery. Let's do stream enhancement. Let's make sure that we've got species diversity. Let's make sure that we don't overfish. Let's give.
Well, when you look at the horsefly run and the Adams River run in the last 2 years, I mean, you can see that with enhancement.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and statistically, it can be proven so clearly that when you do those kinds of things, the return is phenomenal in terms of the amount of money you've had to put in to make it come about. But at the same time, we're spending money on trying to raise these things in net pens. We're bringing Atlantic salmon into the Pacific Ocean. We're doing genetic engineering to try and genetically produce the, quote, perfect fish. You know, I mean, it seems to be a human approach to problem solving that instead of solving the problem, compounds the problem. Because in every case when we do that, we run into the situation where we end up having to deal with the problems that we've created through the solution.
With our forestry industry, what kind of an example are we setting for the equatorial nations? I mean, we're asking them not to cut down the forests because we like to be able to breathe. We're looking at global warming, and yet here in Canada, we're actually cutting down our forests at a greater rate than they are in Brazil.
Well, the example that we're setting is one where you maximize your profit, and you seem to do so over a very short time frame, and that's the problem. There are some very real solutions to the problem, BC forest industry. I'm proposing now that we embark on an integrated land use management strategy for the province of British Columbia. I think that's critical. We have to do that. I think it needs to be done in conjunction with member municipalities of the UBCM, the Union of BC Municipalities, and regional districts. There has to be a cooperative effort to bring together an integrated land use management strategy that will recognize three fundamental things. Number one, there has to be the protection and maintenance of wilderness areas. That has to be done. Number two, there has to be a recognition that you must protect, at all costs, protect the watershed areas. Watershed management, watershed protection is essential. If we don't do that, then we're really putting the population, all species population, whether it's human or others, in jeopardy, including the forest, in jeopardy. So that's the second thing. And the third thing we have to recognize is that there will be areas where we are going to involve ourselves in farming trees. And I mean farming trees in the truest sense of the term. And as we do that, we have to recognize that there are very real alternatives in many instances to clear-cut logging, and that those alternatives can be used. They can be used productively. They can be used to maximize profit within a longer time frame. They can be used to maintain employment of either IWA workers. All of those things can be done, but we need a cooperative effort to make it come about. And at the moment, there isn't even any dialogue, because there's such conflict between the environmental group and the loggers, and between the government and the companies, that nobody trusts anybody. And without trust, without an ability to say, look, we're going to put our cards on the table, we're going to work toward an integrated land use management strategy that serves not only the players that are in the game, but serves the environment as a whole and the population as a whole. Until we start to do that, we're really going to run ourselves the risk of completely destroying what is, I think, the best, and perhaps I'll even go as far as say it's the backbone of the British Columbia economy.
On a different tack, why do you think the Green Plan in California failed so dismally? I mean,
well, I think that the problem with the Green Plan in California was that it comes back again to this whole business of the motives that are in place when you introduce these programs. And I think what happened with the Green Plan was that while it was seen to be an embracing of some very real and I think very necessary objectives, that the political reality of it was that the groundwork was not done in terms of education, in terms of introduction of the plan through proper educational format. So that as soon as there seemed to be some kind of relief to the problem, everybody said, well, that's fine, we can now go back to our old ways. And we'll reject the notion that the Green Plan should be in place for any length of time. That's a problem. That's a big problem, because I mean, you could see it with the peace movement as an example. I mean, one asked the question, why was the peace movement so silent prior to the beginning of the Gulf War? It's because what had happened in Eastern Europe appeared to be the ultimate solution, that the Cold War was over, the wall was coming down in Berlin, and life was going to get better, without recognizing that the root cause of the conflict, the root cause of war generally, is still there. And that's what we have to do within our environment. We have to understand that until we address the lifestyle question, until we address the question of living within definable limits, until we say that there is a difference between quality of life and standard of living, and understand that one is a measure that is a more of a holistic sort of spiritual measure, and the other is an economic measure, until we can say that this quality of life is more important in the long term for us and for our family and for future generations than what we may see as a standard of living today, until we address those questions, the Green Plan or any other plan isn't going to do the job.
do you think the Citizens Forum traveling about the country right now demonstrates the apathy Canadians have towards the future of Canada?
I don't think it's really an apathy, to be honest with you. I think that Canadians, first of all,
The fact that the meetings were filled with 5 people?
yeah, but I mean, I don't think that's apathy. Really, I don't. I think it's a frustration, and I think it's a sense of almost despair. I think people are fed up with it. They're fed up with the discussion. They don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to deal with it. And I blame the government, all governments, federal and provincial, for this question. Canadians have not been encouraged over the last 15 years to involve themselves in nation building. We simply have not been encouraged to do that, because politicians have found for too long that it's better to keep the population served with whatever it is that satisfies their needs between elections, so that politicians can get reelected, rather than going forward and saying, we're going to build a nation here that's going to be a model to all other nations. You see, until we do that, we're never going to address the lifestyle questions that are needed to be addressed in Canada. And there is no doubt that our Constitution must be amended, it must be reformed, and there has to be a mechanism whereby the regions and the provinces are given equality in this country. There is no equality between the regions and the provinces, and that's a serious, serious problem. Now, the Citizens Forum, again, it's from the top-down kind of model. You know, the government's going to provide this little group of people that's going to travel out from Ottawa, head across the country, and we're going to listen to your concerns and then go back and make a decision. That's not the way it's going to work. The decision has to be made right in the neighborhoods, right in the communities, so that people see that their daily life is going to be able to affect the change that's needed in this country through the avenues that are available to them within their neighborhood. Never mind a commission that flies out and gives us a couple of days in Western Canada from Ottawa. That kind of decentralized empowerment of the people is essential if we're to have this country survive as a nation. And it doesn't mean because you decentralize that kind of decision making, it doesn't mean because you empower the people that you necessarily get rid of a strong central government. It means that the strong central government has now finally recognized that the people have a right to have a say, and that the government is there to serve the people and not to serve the private interests, the financial interests that put them in power in the first place. And until we address those questions, I think there is going to be no real change in British Columbia, no real change in Canada.
Well, until we address those questions, but aren't we looking at a possibility there will be a real change in Canada in the next couple of years?
I think so. I think there is. And clearly, I mean, I made a very strong and impassioned speech against the Meech Lake Accord because I didn't like the way that accord would have essentially created two equalities in Canada. One equality for Quebec and the other equality for the rest of Canada. We have to have the three fundamental equalities maintained. One is in the fundamental rights and freedoms of the individual. Every individual must be equal. We have to recognize that while there were two founding nations, there is also Aboriginal nations and there is also the multicultural future of this country. And thirdly, we have to recognize that no matter where you live in Canada, that each province, each region must have equality within the laws of the country. And right now that third equality and the second equality do not exist.
How about selling water to the U.S.? Right now they've got the worst drought in California they've ever had. And
well, this is something I'm very passionate about. It would be a horrendous mistake for British Columbians or Canadians to get into wholesale bulk export of water to the United States. If we're going to sell water to the United States, if you're going to bottle it, sell it as bottled water in a finished product, that's one thing. My personal preference is that we should be selling water to the Americans in the form of Canadian beer, Canadian wine, Canadian canned vegetables, Canadian frozen vegetables, every other process that requires water. There is not a single industrial process, not one, that doesn't require in some stage of its production the use of water. And for us to involve ourselves in wholesale export of water would be the most stupid thing that Canadians could ever do.
Gordon, on that note, we've got to finish. Our time's up. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I'd also like to thank Anderson's Restaurant for providing us with this beautiful venue. For contact, I'm Craig Delahunt. Please join us again next time.